Once again, this is inorganic groups, the D8 group module. We're going to touch briefly on organic groups, and then we'll launch into the newer version of this being the group module. Quickly about me, I work for Mobomo, a development engineer for these guys for about, I guess, really just 7 months now full time, but I've been working for them for quite a few years. Live and work remotely out of Birmingham. Married 19 years or so to my college sweetheart. Got 2 kids, homeschooled them. I have a bachelor's from Alabama and a master's in French, of all things. I love to play music, big fish head, bluegrass. That's me out there in the Twitterverse and all the other things. And I've been doing Drupal front end primarily for about 10 years or so. Try and get into the contribution space as much as I can, not as often as I'd like. But yeah. Mobomo has a pretty big federal footprint. This is just a snapshot of the clients that we've worked for. I personally work almost completely full-time on USGS. Yeah. So, quick disclosure about why I chose this topic. I feel obliged to tell that I have been working with organic groups as in a D7 environment for USGS for about 2 years, maybe even 3 by now. We've talked about a D8 migration. This is, basically my own informal exploration of what's out there, what's available if we were to ever do that. This is not a formal thing that they've tasked us to do, but I decided since we mentioned moving to D8 that I would like to see what was out there. So that's kind of where this all started. I'm not an expert on either module, but I have used OG and D7 quite a lot more than any of the other scenarios I'll mention. I will not have all the answers, but I will do my best to get back to you. And just keep in mind that this talk is not a death match between organic groups versus group, because both do exist for both D7 and D8. This isn't necessarily about who's the best. So why or why not organic groups? So we'll do a quick pro-con thing about D7 and D8 options. Both of these modules do several things well. They have this concept of a group, which you kind of need for a lot of scenarios when you're building a Drupal site. How content relates to that group, building those relationships, etc. Both options do have the concept of membership in a group, so you have people and roles and permissions and all that kind of stuff that comes with membership in a group. I just said that. There are very few assumptions that either module makes about what you're going to use this for. So a lot of times, a module is very opinionated about why it exists, but these are pretty agnostic about what you can do with them. And I don't. Oh, this is where I gave a similar talk about. Not really a similar talk, a different talk about Drupal 7 and how we use taxonomy and organic groups for USGS. So you can kind of see a different case study about the use of organic groups. Whoops, that transitions. All right, and so D7, I specifically say D7 for organic groups for all this because D8, number one, I haven't played with the D8 organic groups version, and last I had looked when I put this presentation together, the development of D8 organic groups was stalled, which seems to have recently changed. I'll get to that in just a second. So specifically on D7, there's a widely adopted organic groups is used on thousands and thousands of sites. There are, like I said, there are few assumptions, but lots of easy developer experience kind of goodies, lots of easy functions that are named intelligently that makes a lot of sense. A lot of the functionality behind the scenes that you can call on. It is full featured, so it has a lot of the things I mentioned. It's got roles and permissions. You can override per group. You have views integration, some default views that it comes with. It even has access to fields based on whether you're a group member or not. You can register for a group within the user registration process. All that's kind of already built into organic groups in D7. And I'm going to assume D8 will function pretty much the same way. The biggest pro here is definitely this last point, in that there are literally dozens of extra contrib modules that tie into organic groups itself. So you have things like OG taxonomy, which lets you have a group specific vocabulary. So only this group has access to these terms and can use those terms and edit those terms and whatever. You also have OG menu, where you can do a menu per group. Workbench moderation, so you can have different permissions on workflows, things like that. Scald. Has anybody used Scald in here for multimedia before? Anybody? Nobody? There's one hand back there. Scald's a great multimedia management module that we've been using for USGS and for NASA, actually. That has an OG module as well. So lots of integration with various contrib modules, and then I got this cool little graphic. If you've never seen this before, is the most downloaded Drupal modules. So let's see, OG made the cut there. Cons for organic groups. It relies on an entity reference field to keep track of the relationship. So one of the maintainers, or I guess former maintainer of OG and D7 himself, called this abusing the field API. So there's something kind of dirty feeling about using a field to create this relationship, and you'll see what I mean later when we get into group more. Some of the UX is a little confusing. There's, like I said, it uses fields for all of the different aspects of the different functionalities. And the more you play with organic groups, you understand what I mean by all this. I'll show you the screenshot in a sec. Config per group type separate. I forget what that point was about. So yeah, D8 again recently picked up momentum again. So I don't know, if some of this has changed, if it's improved. Definitely check it out, pitch in, etc. This is just a screenshot of the field UI, which drives me crazy. That's specific to the organic group stuff. So you can give it, a new field for. It actually uses a field for roles and permissions. It uses a field for whether it's a group or not. And it uses a field for organic groups for OG vocabularies. If you use the OG taxonomy module, etc. This screen can get really unwieldy if you have lots and lots of different node types that are groups. All right, well. All right, so on to D8, which is where we all want to live eventually. Get out of D7, move on. In D8, the group module uses a fully fieldable entity for the group. So we're not repurposing nodes. I guess I didn't really mention that. For D7, you basically enable an existing content type, so a node. You can enable taxonomies theoretically, but if you enable a content type as a group, it's still just a node. So it's sort of confusing in that aspect. In this world, the group D8 module, the group is an entity type of its own. So groups are a fully fieldable first-class object in Drupal. It has great developer experience, a great API. It has, uses all of your object-oriented principles and classes and plugins. It uses all of Drupal's D8 goodness in all the right ways. You have this separate membership and relationship membership/relationship entities. So, and you'll see this much more clearly in just a second with the chart, but basically you've got this intermediary entity that is defining the relationship between your group and the content or the members. So you have a single group in D8 cannot override the group type level setting. So if you have for instance, a group type that has this set of permissions, in the group module, a group will always function as it's set up to do. In Drupal 7 organic groups, you have this option of overriding and saying, well, this group I want actually to have its own custom set of permissions that overrides the group type level stuff. This screenshot's just showing this is a fully fieldable entity type, just like a node, but this is actually a group entity type. The cons thus far, there are a few. There are some things that are confusing if you're just jumping into it, but hopefully we'll clear some of that up. Like I said, just some of the wording is a little awkward and it just it's not intuitive at times. There is a pretty big gap here which kept me from exploring the conversion of USGS at all because of things that are completely missing. There are config entities, so a menu is actually a config entity and not a real entity. And it doesn't currently yet have the ability to integrate with those config entities. So there is action on this. There's an issue going on with it. There's active patches. So it's going to be fixed. It's just a matter of time. And the thing I mentioned as a pro, which is also sort of a con, in that if you wanted to have a situation where I've got a certain group type, but I want this one instance of a group to have its own little set of rules, you just can't do that anymore. So this is just an example of the way that the creation of a group happens. So if you use the defaults, I'll show this all in just a minute in the demo, it'll be much more clear, but when you're creating a new group, if you just go with the defaults, you have this middle step that creates the membership entity, which is in between the group itself and the content that you're going to create. So there's that middle entity. And so you get to this second step if you don't set it up right, and you go, wait a minute, it says add group, and all you get is the URL alias field. And then, it's really confusing as to where you are and what you're doing at this step when you get to this. I'll do this intentionally on the demo real quick in just a second. So again, this is the chart that I sort of stole from Mike Annell of Drupal Easy. He did a good podcast on this. There's a bunch of links at the end that you'll see. So essentially, the diagram was like this. You got your group, whatever that group is, whatever group type you have. And then you've got nodes, any content type really. But you also have users, and all these things need to relate to your group somehow. Like I said, in Drupal 7, Organic Groups does this with fields. In this D8 group module, you have these intermediate, whatever, relationship entities. So you have an entity in between that defines that relationship, and that entity itself is fully fieldable. So you can have things like a field that says, why are you joining this group? And you can just require them to say what's their reason for joining a group, or how long have you been a fan of this band or whatever. Anything you want that describes the relationship that's not necessarily relevant to the content itself, right? So, does that make sense? Any questions so far?
That was on the group membership you were just referring to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so they're all, the group itself is fieldable, the relationship entity is fieldable, and then of course your nodes themselves and whatever else, and your users for that matter, are all fieldable. All right, so I guess the answer to the question why or why not OG, in Drupal 7 I think the answer is probably organic groups still, especially with the contrib world pitching in so many extra little goodies that you can do, like menus and taxonomy and all that great stuff. In D8 I think so far the clear winner is group, except like I said there's quite a few things that are still missing, and organic groups in D8 has recently sort of rebooted the development. Looks like even in the last couple of weeks there's been commits, so I've just been keeping an eye on that to see where that goes. Haven't had a chance to try it yet, but we'll see. Cool. So, demo. So I just spun up one of these Simply Test Me worlds, and everybody used simplytest.me? Everybody? Not everybody, but a lot of people probably. If you haven't, simplytest.me is really cool. It lets you spin up a Drupal test environment, and you can specify, kind of what's your basis for the site. You could do like, it can be a install profile. It can be just a single module, and then you can get pretty fancy with additional projects and patches to projects. If you want to get real crazy, you can build basically your ideal environment. Once you get it built though, you can't start adding things that I could tell. I couldn't make that work, just so you know. So if you think of something you meant to add later down the road, you'd be like, crap. Okay, so obviously one of the main things you're going to have to do is enable modules. So the group module itself is clearly part of the thing, but group node is the module that defines the fact that we can relate nodes to groups. So we'll install that. And then you'll notice probably right off the bat that you have a top level item for groups. This was conscious decision. It doesn't go under structure. It's just where it goes. They did this very much on purpose and had lots of reasons for it. You can find them in various talks that the guy who wrote the module put out there. So here we go. So here's groups. We want to create a group. Well, we can't add any groups unless we have group type stuff. So we're going to add a new group type. We're going to go with like a fan site, like a band kind of thing. So we're going to create bands, groups, a group for each band, basically. So if you're into a band, you can join that group. All right, so I'm just going to leave this for the moment at the defaults, just so you kind of see one step at a time what your options are. So the first thing it asks you, does the group creator automatically become a member? I mean, typically that would make sense, so that's a pretty good default. If you uncheck this, of course, when you create it, you're not automatically a member, so if you want that to happen, keep it checked. This one I think personally should be the other way around. I don't think this should be checked by default, but that's just me. It does say, if you have fields on membership and do not use the wizard, you may end up with required fields not filled out. So basically what this says is the group creator must complete their membership. It says, when I create a new group, I'm also becoming a member. All right, well, if I'm also becoming a member and there's this intermediate entity that potentially has fields on it, do we want the person creating the group to have to fill that relationship entity out? Now, if you don't have any fields on that, it makes no sense. And when you initially create a group type like this, you obviously aren't going to have any fields on the relationship either, right? So to me, this is unchecked by default, but it comes checked by default. But if you know you're going to add fields to the relationship, fine, leave it checked. But just keep that in mind. That's what happens. I'm going to leave it checked just so you can see what happens. We're going to automatically configure an administrative role for our person who becomes a member when they create it. Well, that's a separate checkbox. So you can configure an administrative role, but then you also have to say, do we also give the creator, so they get membership, but do they also get to be an admin of the group? So you have to specify all this stuff when you can come back and edit these, of course, but I'm just going to save it like that. Cool. So, and this rebuild permissions just keeps coming up, so I'm going to ignore it for just a minute, and we'll click on it after a little bit. So, we're going to add a new group now. And notice that it skips, if I had two group types, you'd have an intermediate step that says, which type do you want to create. In this case, anybody, favorite bands? Shout it out. Come on.
The Spiders from
Led Zeppelin. I heard Led Zeppelin. Not sure how that's spelled. Led Zeppelin. So notice that the button here says create band and complete your membership. Now, depending on whatever checkboxes I checked before, this wording changes and what happens next changes, right? So in this case, I left that checkbox checked that says I need group creators to fill out their membership. So I'm going to create the band and complete my membership. Now this is the part that I was showing as a WTF, like add group URL alias. I'm so confused as to what I'm looking at here because it doesn't say anything about the relationship entity. It says save group and membership, so I'm really confused at this point. This was one of the first things that really threw me off about this. So unchecking that checkbox in that first step that says make them fill out their membership will skip this step and go straight to here. So now we're done with, we have, so we're actually thrown into the relationship entity too. So this is another problem with this. If you don't have any fields on the relationship, so now I'm looking at, this is actually, if you look at the path, you can tell where you are sort of a little bit better. So I'm in group 1, and then I'm in some sort of related content. In this case, it's the relationship of my membership in this group. Does that make sense? It's pretty confusing. So you can sort of tell by the breadcrumbs where you are too, but I would go back to here. And of course, we can go back to here and we can always add fields and things like that. And in fact, let's go back and edit this to not make people complete their membership. We can do fields here, of course, and I'm just going to do one just for kicks. Description. One. Cool. So then we'll add another one here. So this is going to be Beatles, the Beatles / Beatles. Cool. So create band and become member. Now that said something different before. Remember it said like create band and create membership, something like that, complete membership. So this skips right over that step now, right? So this, to me, the workflow makes a lot more sense this way, unless you actually need to define, more metadata on the relationship itself. So right off the bat, when we actually create the group, you've got, just like anything else, you've got fields which you can fiddle with, the display. So manage display. I can take this off, for instance. Oops, not content groups. It's not content. When we go to look at the Beatles, Now it's just like any entity, right? So you have all the beauty of the field API on your content type. So here's related entities tab. Cool. So in fact, let me back up one more step here to our types. And again, look at this drop down. So you got your managed fields, form display, and display, just like any other entity type. The edit is editing the group type itself. Then you got these three, which are much more interesting. So permissions by default have, well, 4 roles, I guess. 3 really, unless you, in the creation of it, you tell it to create that administrative role, which we did. So we're going to have 4. You have anonymous. Obviously, anonymous is anonymous. An outsider is someone who's registered but is not a part of the group. Someone who's a member, and then an admin, right? So you've got all these roles that are configured. Before I do anything here, I'm going to go back over here to this content tab and notice. So this is where we define what content types are available as group content. Another way of thinking of it is these are available content types which have either been enabled as group content or have not yet been enabled as group content. So what's something we might use for a band? We might have like albums, right? You have songs, you have albums, you could do all kinds of stuff. So we're going to just create a quick content type for this. And it has a body, and we could add we could do whatever we want for this content type, but just to keep it simple, I'm going to stick with real plain. I'm going to set available content. Now I have group node album. So again, this is one of the things I think this should just say relationship entity or something like that. It's a little less confusing. So we're going to install it. Several options here. One of this is how many. Let me just read it. The amount of band groups a single content entity can be added as a group node. So, when you create an album, can it be associated with more than one group, basically? All right. And amount of times a single content entity can be added to the same band. So that's sort of the opposite in a way. It's just how many times can it be attached to the same group. And this is locked down in this case by the node, the group node module. But you could create some sort of plugin for some other entity type to be group content, and you can make this allowed to have the same entity tied to the same group multiple times for some reason. This is similar to the other part where we have to create the relationship. So before we were talking about the 2-step wizard in creating a new group and whether or not that relationship entity has to be filled out. And here we're talking about the relationship between the group and the content itself. So the first one was about the creator, the membership entity of the user. This is about the membership of this piece of content, the album itself, and whether or not there are extra steps. I'm going to leave it, again, just the way it is by default to see what that looks like. Cool. So once it's enabled, you can uninstall it, which one thing that's really good about that is, you may have a situation where, like articles is a better example, you may or may not, when you're creating articles, you may or may not associate them with a group. Maybe there's sort of like a top level article that is on your homepage and it has nothing to do with a specific group. Well, if you were to uninstall this, that doesn't break that. It really, all it does is say there's no longer a defined relationship entity between the group type band and the content type article or whatever you're messing with. Does that make sense? So it doesn't break things if you uninstall. It just gets rid of the relationships and you lose all those relationships. And again, this is all fieldable. So if you wanted to add fields to the relationship, again, we're talking about the relationship between an album and a group. You could throw something in here, and I'll actually do that this time. We'll call it why added. So maybe you want somebody to say why they're adding this album to this band or something. I don't know. It's a stupid field, but we're going to make people fill it out anyway. Cool. So then we go back to our groups. Oops, list. All right. One thing it's confusing right away is you only have the option at the moment to relate existing entities to the group. Now this is because we had previously quickly looked at the permissions tab for the group types. But we're going to look a little closer at it now because this actually matters now. So on the permission screen, now that we have a content type enabled as a group content, we have new checkboxes, which do not automatically get picked up for our admin users. I'm going to grab these. Just a small little annoyance, and again, you've got, so remember, any content type that I enable as group content, I have this full set of permissions. So I can do this for all the roles and any custom roles I define. So I can say, admin can create and edit, and members can create and edit, but only admin can delete or whatever, right? Yeah.
Is that still down on the main permission screen too? Or
These are completely separate from Drupal permissions. Yeah, you can't see these permissions at all on the... Before I eat my words, let me check. I don't think they're there at all, but they might be. Node. They are not there. So they are completely separate from Drupal's actual, high-level permissions. They don't show up there. Doesn't know about them. And so you can actually, again, notice that you have access to define the permissions for the relationship entities the same way too. So you can, you can define all this stuff really granularly. That's fun to say. Great. So now we'll go back to our groups. Go to Beatles. Save entities. And of course, that doesn't work because Drupal. It's under... I'll go ahead and do this rebuild permissions too, get that off our screen. I find that it comes back for various times for various reasons. Whatever. Great, back to the Beatles. Related content now has 2 buttons. So before we could relate existing entities, and now we have the permissions to create new entities. So I'm going to create a new entity, and in this case, again, there's only one type, but if you had multiple types, you'd get an extra step to choose what kind of content you want to create for all the ones that are enabled. In fact, just for the sake of demonstration, we'll do that really quickly. We're going to enable articles. Don't have that. Great. And then, oops, well, it doesn't matter. Great. So now you have this extra step in between. So which one do we want to create? Let's create an album. I don't know if that's actually the name of it, but whatever. Good one. Of course, this is just a node. You're creating a node, and it behind the scenes is creating this relationship entity, which is this. So it takes you to the second step. Again, we can rearrange these. We could actually, which I would probably do, would be to pull this URL alias out of there, because I'm not ever going to visit the page for the relationship entity. Now, there might be cases where you would, and it makes sense, and you might want to even use something like Path Auto or whatever to get that automatically populated and hide it and that kind of thing. Just because. So create content in Led Zeppelin, which is kind of cool. So you already created the node, but now you're creating the relationship. Alright, so Related Entities tab now has this actual album on it, and there you go. And again, this is, you can edit the relationship, which is just, again, editing what we created a second ago.
Since,
Yeah.
say the article or whatever, is already associated with a group entity type, can you just establish a relationship inside the node?
You should be able to, so for instance, let's go, the question was, can you associate a piece of content that's already been tied to a group to another group?
It's when you're creating the node, rather than having to create this relationship, which is a secondary step. If you're creating an article or an album or whatever, can you just establish the relationship to the group entity from the node rather than going through this create?
You would skip that step completely if you didn't have any fields on it. So if we
I think what he's asking is more like an OG. If you just go to the normal add content screen for Drupal and say add an album.
Right, gotcha.
There's nothing.
There
on
is
that
no
form
mechanism to do that
put in
currently
there.
that I'm aware of.
That's one of
So
the-
yeah, let me just clarify for the recording. The question is actually going through the node add page rather than through the group side of things. Can you create that relationship that establishes the link between the group and the node itself? And as far as I'm aware, you cannot. Again, I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think so. I don't think so. We can try it. Let's try it. We're going to create an album. There's nothing here for sure. Yeah. So unless you're going through, and also you'll notice that the reason probably, I'm sure, is that if you're going through here, notice what your path is, right? So it's group 2 content create. So it already knows, hey, I'm creating content, it's for a group relationship, I know which group ID I need, and so it already has that kind of established for the group module. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. That would be nice. Great, so where was I? I think really that's the gist, the bottom line of most everything. Let me go back to my slides just for a minute. This is the basics of creating groups and group types and content and memberships and all that kind of stuff. Any other questions thus far before I go back over that?
We've talked about group and organic groups. Those are two different modules.
They are, yeah. So
Can you kind of talk about the differences?
that's what the first part was about. So D7 group was out there in D7, but it was a latecomer, and organic groups had already basically owned that space, and they've got it all figured out. But the D8 group module was backported to D7, or maybe the other way around. But either way, there is a version of group for D7 as well, but I've never used it. It doesn't have the traction that OG does. It doesn't have all those extra contrib goodness that you can use that makes it just definitely the solution for D7 in my opinion.
But functionally, they do the same thing.
Functionally, yeah, essentially, and that's yeah. But in D8, the organic groups is not really mature enough to use at this point that I'm aware of. It kind of stalled for a good while and nobody was doing anything with it, but in the last couple of weeks it's taken up some new steam. Somebody's really jumped in there. Cool, so this is just a couple quick recap screenshots. You got to turn on the modules. You have to create group types before you can create groups. And then you remember this nice little checkbox, which this helps you decide whether or not you're going to have this middle step when you're creating new groups to deal with the membership entity for the user who's creating the group. So whether the group creator gets to be a member automatically, whether they must complete the membership, we automatically configure a role, automatically assign an admin role to creator, and then the submit button on your new group affected by whatever combination of checkboxes is relevant. So as you play with that and see different scenarios play out, you'll see what it'll mean a little bit more clearly. Again, with group content, you have to install the plugin for any entity type you want to be as grouped content. And by installing a group content type, you are basically just creating that relationship entity type and establishing that there is a potential for a piece of content to be tied to a group. Again, the two-step wizard is about relationship between the content and the group, similar to the membership entity when you create the group in the first place. Membership, fieldable, yeah. Cool. So each relationship, again, the entity types, the relationships themselves are fieldable. They describe the relationship of the content to the group. The content which is related to a group is subject to its rules, but not all entities of a particular type are necessarily related to a group. So that was talking about an article that's not necessarily part of a group. So uninstalling the plugin deletes relationship entities, but it doesn't affect existing related entities. The entity itself still exists. You're not deleting I would not be deleting the album if I delete the relationship entity. Okay, so then you've got roles and permissions. There are some that are, you're going to need to tweak right off the bat. You're going to want to, establish the view, be able to view groups for at least outsiders, if not anonymous, depending on your setup. You want people to be able to see the group so they can request membership or join, however that happens for you. Probably don't want to allow the administrator to leave the group, maybe. But you definitely are going to have to go through these just like any site and think about your permissions for a particular group type. And also you've got all these permissions for the group content as well as the relationship entity as well. On the related entities tab, you have all of your entities that are related to a group, including your users. Relate existing entity will let you link users or content if that plugin's installed, so you can create a relationship between that piece of content that's already there. If no content types have been installed, it takes you straight to the add member form. And creating new entities, you of course again have to have that relationship entity installed, and you can add a new node and its relationship in one step or two depending on how you have it set up. And you cannot add members from here, so you can create a new user and establish their membership in a group at the same time. And so this is a little bit about views. Now I didn't have enough time to really dig into this, but I had a few problems trying to build views. I noted that you're going to start, at least in the way I worked it out, was the view itself should be based on the group content, so that relationship entity in between, because that way you have direct access to both the content or the member or the user, whichever side of the things you're on, and the group itself. So by using the group content as the basis for the view, you have direct access to both things right off the bat, if that makes sense. I was having trouble with contextual filters, so I ended up messing with this a little bit and I thought group ID from URL would make the most sense, but I ended up using the raw value. And you can see the pattern that it uses there, and you can set up, and just use arg1 or arg3 depending on what it is. And then you have this cool little feature in the blocks situation, which lets you restrict visibility to particular group types. So if you have a block, you just want it only to be visible on group type band, and you can do that. Quick brainstorming, which is some things we could have done to, build up that site. You could do things like flagging favorite albums. This is all superfluous. Doesn't really have anything to do with the content. Just some more stuff we could have done with our little demo. And we actually have talked about this quite a bit. There's some some bugs still. It's still very much under construction, but for the most part, the D8 module works pretty great. They definitely could use some contributions, so feel free to jump in there. There's a bunch of links here. There's tons of videos and audio here. Feel free to. I'll have these slides on there, of course, on the site. And then that's it. Any other questions before we wrap it up?
Just gonna say that making groups of groups is very easy. You don't need any intermediary modules or anything like that.
Yeah.
Things just kind of work because it's all in details.
Nice. Cool. Yeah.
Any thoughts about a migration?
I don't know that I would attempt it personally, but I'm sure it could be done. That was actually one of the things I was a little concerned about. But migrating would definitely be tricky because you've got, like you said, that the D7 stuff uses fields for organic groups, and then if you go to group in D8, then you have this whole, you have to establish all new entities for each relationship, and I don't know. I mean, I'm sure again anything can be done with enough time and money, but I wouldn't try it right off the bat. All right. Cool. Thank you.